You think you know Viking sexuality, beards, raids, shield maidens, but there's a shadow in the sagas nobody talks about. In the Old Norse world, being called Arger could get you killed, not for loving men, for taking the passive role. The difference mattered more than life itself. What did homosexuality actually look like in Viking society? Why were some acts celebrated while others meant social death? And what happens when we dig into the graves and find the truth buried with the bones? If you value documented Viking and Norse era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the prose, Edda, and archaeological findings from Scandinavia. Now back to the story. The word sits in Old Norse like a blade, Arger. It means unmanly, but not the way you think. Vikings didn't fear homosexuality, they feared submission. The active partner in male relations faced no shame. The passive one faced everything. Death, exile, the loss of honor that mattered more than gold. This wasn't about love or desire. This was about power written in flesh. 900 years ago, in the law codes of medieval Iceland, the Gragas spells it out. Call a man Arger, and he can challenge you to holmgang, single combat to the death. Refuse, and you owe him compensation. But if he really is Arger, if he takes the receiving role with another man, he loses all legal rights, no inheritance, no voice in the Thing assembly, no protection under law. The community could stone him, exile him, or worse. The sagas are full of this tension. In Ingjald's saga, written in the 13th century but describing events from the 10th, Flosi Thordarson hurls the ultimate insult at Njaal's sons. He calls them women, suggests they take the passive role. The accusation triggers a blood feud that burns down houses and kills dozens. Words about sexual position start wars, but here's where it gets complex. The same culture that killed passive men celebrated active ones. In the Lokasenna, Loki accuses Odin himself of practicing cedar magic, taking a woman's role in ritual. The other gods don't deny it, they just change the subject. Even the All-Father could bend gender rules when power demanded it. Archaeological evidence backs this up. At Birka, in Sweden, grave BJ 581 holds a warrior buried with weapons and sacrifice victims. DNA testing in 2018 revealed the warrior was female. The community honored her as a man in death because she lived as one in life. Gender wasn't biology, it was performance, and performance could shift when strength required it. The key difference was penetration. Norse society drew lines around who entered and who received. Active partners in male relations kept their masculine status. They might even gain prestige. Ibn Fadlan, the Arab diplomat who witnessed Viking culture firsthand in 922, describes young slave boys kept for sexual purposes. Nobody questioned the owner's manhood. The slaves had no honor to lose. This shows up in the legal codes. The Frostithing law from Norway, written in the 11th century, sets penalties for sexual insults. Call a man a mare, a passive horse, and you owe 3 marks of silver. Call him a stallion, and there's no penalty at all. The law protects against accusations of receiving, not giving. But Vikings didn't live in a world of pure heterosexuality either. The concept didn't exist. Men formed deep bonds that blurred lines we draw today. In the Volsunga saga, Sigurd and Gunnar swear blood brotherhood, mixing their blood and passing under 3 strips of turf. The ritual creates kinship stronger than marriage. Some historians argue these bonds included sexual elements. Others say they were purely political. The sagas don't spell it out. What we do know is that Vikings recognized relationships beyond simple categories. In Grettir's saga, the outlaw Grettir forms a partnership with Glommer that the text describes in intimate terms. They share beds, resources, and dangers. When Glommer dies, Grettir grieves like a widow. The saga never calls it homosexual, but the emotional content runs deeper than friendship. Norse mythology complicates this further. Loki shifts between male and female forms, bears children as a mare, and seduces giants in feminine disguise. The gods accept this shape-shifting because it serves their purposes. Loki's gender fluidity makes him powerful, not shameful. But when he submits to others sexually, the other gods mock him. Even in myth, the line is about dominance, not gender. The reality was messier than the laws suggest. In Iceland's remote valleys, men lived together for months during winter nights. The sagas hint at relationships that developed in isolation. In Gisli Saga, 2 brothers-in-law share a bed for warmth and end up in a sexual relationship that scandalizes their community. The text treats it as tragedy, not crime. Social pressure, not legal punishment, destroys them. Trading voyages created more opportunities. Norse merchants traveled for months with all-male crews. Arabic sources from Cordoba describe Viking traders who kept young men as companions. The arrangements were temporary, tied to specific journeys. When the ships returned home, the relationships ended. Nobody questioned what happened on the water. Some scholars argue that Vikings distinguished between situational and preferential homosexuality. Men who turned to other men because women weren't available faced less stigma than men who chose male partners when women were present. The difference mattered in communities where reputation determined survival. Archaeological evidence from Denmark tells a different story. At Tisø, excavations uncovered a great hall complex from the 6th to 11th centuries. Among the finds were amulets depicting men in intimate positions. The images aren't crude or mocking. They're crafted with the same care as fertility symbols. Someone valued these objects enough to bury them with precious goods. The Tisø finds suggest that sexual diversity existed alongside social restrictions. Elite Vikings might have practiced homosexuality privately while enforcing public taboos. Power created exceptions to rules that killed common men. Jarls and kings could afford to break boundaries that slaves died crossing. Norse women complicate the picture further. The sagas describe mannish women who fought, led raids, and rejected marriage. Freydis Eiriksdottir led her own expedition to Vinland and murdered rivals with her own hands. The text never questions her femininity, but it describes her in masculine terms. She takes the active role in violence, the traditional male sphere. Some of these women may have had relationships with other women. The evidence is thin, but it exists. In the Laxdæla saga, two women form a partnership so close that their husbands become jealous. They share secrets, resources, and what the text calls special affection. The saga treats their bond as natural, even admirable, but female homosexuality faced different restrictions than male. Norse law punished men for passive roles, but ignored female sexuality entirely. Women had fewer legal rights to lose. They couldn't inherit major property or participate in the thing assembly anyway. Sexual transgression cost them less because they owned less. This created space for relationships that men couldn't risk. The sagas describe women's friendships in intimate detail, sharing beds, secrets, and emotional bonds that last for decades. Some historians read these as lesbian relationships disguised as friendship. Others see them as intense platonic bonds in a culture that separated the sexes. The truth probably includes both. Vikings lived in a world where survival mattered more than sexual categories. People formed the relationships they needed, whether for warmth, protection, companionship, or love. The community judged results, not methods. Christianity changed everything. When Norse culture converted in the 10th and 11th centuries, new sexual rules arrived with new gods. The Christian church taught that all homosexual acts were sins, not just passive ones. This created broader restrictions than traditional Norse culture imposed. But conversion happened slowly. In Iceland, the Althing voted to accept Christianity in the year 1000 Dagros, but old practices continued for generations. The sagas, written by Christian authors in the 13th and 14th centuries, preserve memories of pre-Christian attitudes. They describe homosexual relationships with complexity, not simple condemnation. Some Norse Christians found ways to blend old and new values. They accepted Christian teachings about sexual sin while maintaining Norse ideas about honor and dominance. The result was a hybrid culture that punished sexual submission, but tolerated other forms of same-sex intimacy. Archaeological evidence from Christianized Scandinavia shows this tension. Grave goods from the 11th century include both Christian crosses and pagan sexual amulets. People buried their dead with symbols from both worlds, hedging their bets about which afterlife awaited them. The conversion also changed how Vikings talked about homosexuality. Pre-Christian texts use specific terms, arger, rasrger, stroden, that focus on sexual position. Christian-influenced sagas use vaguer language, describing relationships as unnatural or against God's will. The precision of older terminology disappears into moral generalities, but the older attitudes survived in hidden ways. Icelandic law continued to punish accusations of passive homosexuality long after Christianization. The legal tradition preserved Norse distinctions even when Christian teachings opposed them. Men could still challenge sexual insults to holmgang combat in the 13th century, 600 years after conversion began. Regional differences mattered too. Danish Vikings had more contact with Christian Europe and adopted new sexual norms earlier. Norwegian Vikings in remote valleys maintained older practices longer. Swedish Vikings developed hybrid approaches that mixed Christian and pagan elements. Iceland, isolated by ocean, preserved the most complete record of pre-Christian attitudes in its sagas and laws. Trade routes spread both acceptance and restriction. Vikings who traveled to Constantinople encountered Byzantine Christianity and its sexual teachings. Those who traded in the Islamic world met different moral codes entirely. The most cosmopolitan Vikings learned to navigate multiple sexual systems, presenting different faces in different markets. Some adapted by becoming more restrictive than traditional Norse culture required. Better to appear pure to Christian trading partners than risk valuable relationships over sexual freedom. Others went the opposite direction, using travel as an excuse to escape home restrictions entirely. The evidence suggests that Viking homosexuality was common, complex, and conditional. Men and women formed same-sex relationships for love, power, survival, and convenience. Society judged these relationships based on roles, not just acts. Active partners maintained status while passive ones lost it. Women faced fewer restrictions, but also fewer opportunities. Most importantly, Vikings didn't think in modern categories. They cared about honor, dominance, family lines, and community survival. Sexual orientation mattered less than sexual performance. As long as someone could fight, lead, and maintain their social position, their private preferences were largely ignored. The slave trade reveals another layer of Viking sexual culture. At Hedeby, the great trading hub on the Danish-German border, Arabic coins from the 9th century pay for human cargo. Young men and boys commanded premium prices in Islamic markets. The Vikings who sold them knew exactly why. Ibn Rusta, writing in 903 Mariskus, describes Norse traders selecting the most attractive male slaves for specific buyers. Beauty increased value. Virginity doubled it. These transactions weren't just commerce, they were cultural exchange. Viking traders learned Islamic attitudes toward male beauty and same-sex relationships. In Baghdad and Cordoba, powerful men kept male lovers without shame. Some Vikings adopted these practices, bringing young male slaves home not just as workers, but as companions. The archaeology backs this up. At Kaupang in Norway, excavations uncovered a trader's house from the 9th century. Among the finds were Islamic glass vessels, Byzantine silk, and jewelry designed for young men. The owner was displaying wealth, but also advertising services. His household included male slaves trained in more than manual labor. Legal codes reveal the complexity of these relationships. The Gulathing law from Western Norway, compiled in the 11th century, sets different penalties for sexual assault based on the victim's status. Rape a free woman, pay 40 marks. Rape a slave woman, pay 4. But rape a male slave, and there's no fine at all. The law assumes male slaves are available for sexual use by their owners. This created a class of men outside normal honor codes. Slave boys from Ireland, Scotland, and the Baltic had no masculine status to protect. Their owners could use them sexually without losing face. When these slaves grew older, some earned freedom through service, others remained in sexual bondage their entire lives. The conversion to Christianity complicated these arrangements. Church law condemned all homosexual acts, including those with slaves. But economic pressures pushed back. Viking traders who gave up the lucrative slave trade faced financial ruin. Many found compromises, selling slaves abroad while maintaining Christian reputations at home. Funeral practices tell another story. At Gamla Uppsala in Sweden, the great burial mounds from the 6th century contain paired male burials. The men were buried with identical weapons, shared grave goods, and positioning that suggests intimate relationships. These weren't master and slave, they were equals in death as in life. Similar paired burials appear across Scandinavia. At Birka, grave 951 holds 2 men buried with their arms intertwined. Their weapons match, their jewelry complements each other, and their bones show similar battle scars. They lived as warriors, fought as partners, and died together. The community honored their bond by burying them as one. But not all same-sex relationships left traces in graves. The poorest Vikings, thralls, freedmen, and landless warriors were buried in unmarked plots that time has erased. Their loves and losses disappeared with their bones. Only the wealthy left evidence for archaeologists to find. This class bias affects what we know about Viking sexuality. Elite relationships appear in sagas and rich graves. Common relationships vanish into silence. The homosexuality we can document was primarily aristocratic, creating a skewed picture of Norse sexual culture. Regional variations add more complexity. In Denmark, close to Christian Europe, same-sex relationships faced earlier restrictions. King Harald Bluetooth, who ruled from 958 to 987, promoted Christian values that included sexual restraint. But archaeological evidence from his reign shows continued acceptance of diverse relationships among the nobility. Norway developed differently. King Olaf Tryggvason, who ruled from 995 to 1000, enforced Christianity with violence. He burned temples, executed pagan priests, and outlawed traditional practices. But even Olaf couldn't change private behavior overnight. The sagas describe his court, including men who maintained same-sex relationships in secret. Sweden remained pagan longest and preserved older sexual attitudes. At Gamla Uppsala, ritual homosexuality continued into the 11th century. Adam of Bremen, writing around 1070 described ceremonies where men took passive roles to honor the gods. Christian observers found these practices disgusting, but Swedish participants saw them as sacred duties. Iceland offers the most complete picture because it preserved the most sources. The island's isolation protected it from rapid cultural change. Old attitudes survived longer, and medieval writers recorded them in detail. The Icelandic sagas contain the richest descriptions of same-sex relationships in medieval literature. But even Icelandic evidence is filtered through Christian authors writing centuries after the events they describe. These writers had complex motives, preserving family histories while conforming to church teachings. They included homosexual relationships in their stories, but often framed them as tragic or unnatural. The result is sources that reveal and conceal simultaneously. The sagas describe same-sex intimacy in vivid detail, then condemn it as sinful or destructive. Readers must decode these mixed messages to understand the original culture. Archaeological chemistry provides clearer evidence. Bone analysis from Scandinavian graves reveals dietary patterns that suggest household arrangements. Men buried together often show similar isotope signatures, indicating they shared food sources for years. This suggests long-term domestic partnerships, not casual relationships. DNA analysis adds another layer. Genetic testing of paired male burials sometimes reveals family relationships, brothers, cousins on or father and son buried together. But in other cases, the men are unrelated. They chose to live and die as family despite sharing no blood. These voluntary bonds may have included sexual elements. Textile analysis tells its own story. Male graves from the Viking period sometimes contain silk ribbons, jewelry, and decorative items typically associated with women. These men were buried with feminine goods because they performed feminine roles in life. Their communities accepted this gender crossing enough to honor it in death. The Oseberg ship burial from 834 presents a puzzle. Two women were buried with the richest grave goods ever found in Scandinavia. One was elderly, probably a queen. The other was younger, perhaps a servant or companion. But their burial positions and shared items suggest a more intimate relationship. If these women were lovers, their burial represents the highest status lesbian relationship in Viking archaeology. The younger woman was sacrificed to accompany her partner to the afterlife, suggesting a bond stronger than political alliance. But this interpretation remains controversial among scholars who prefer less sexual explanations. Poetry preserves attitudes that laws and sagas obscure. In the Havamal, one of the oldest Norse poems, Odin advises young men about relationships. He warns against trusting women, but says nothing negative about male partnerships. The silence speaks louder than condemnation would. Skaldic poetry from the 10th and 11th centuries includes coded references to same-sex relationships. Poets used metaphors and wordplay to discuss forbidden topics. A warrior described as a sword-bearer's bed companion might be more than just a fighting partner. These poems circulated in royal courts where direct speech could be dangerous. The legal evidence becomes clearer when examined closely. The Grugas includes detailed procedures for prosecuting sexual crimes, but the laws focus heavily on male-male relationships, while barely mentioning female-female ones. This suggests that lesbian relationships either weren't considered criminal or weren't considered important enough to regulate. Marriage laws reveal more complexity. Norse marriages were primarily economic and political arrangements. Love was secondary to land deals and family alliances. This created space for emotional and sexual relationships outside marriage. Both men and women might have same-sex lovers while fulfilling marital obligations. Divorce laws support this interpretation. Women could divorce husbands for failing to provide sex, but also for being too sexually demanding. The law recognized that sexual satisfaction was important but negotiable. If marriage didn't provide it, people might seek it elsewhere. The concept of honor ran through all sexual relationships. A man's honor depended on his ability to protect his family, lead his followers, and defeat his enemies. Sexual behavior mattered only when it threatened these core functions. Passive homosexuality suggested weakness that could undermine leadership. Active homosexuality demonstrated dominance that could enhance it. This honor system created different rules for different classes. Jarls and kings had more honor to lose, but also more power to protect it. A king who took male lovers might face gossip, but rarely open challenge. A poor farmer who did the same risked exile or death. Power purchased sexual freedom that weakness couldn't afford. Recent excavations at Repton in England uncovered a Viking mass grave from 873. Among the 264 bodies, forensic analysis revealed evidence of same-sex partnerships. Some skeletons were buried in embracing positions, others with shared grave goods that suggest intimate relationships. The Vikings who died conquering England included couples we would recognize today, but they wouldn't recognize our categories. To them, these were just people who lived, fought, and died together. The love that dared not speak its name in later centuries was simply life as they knew it. Honor mattered. Courage mattered. Everything else was just noise in the wind.